A 20-year-old college student, full of life, eager for the future, steps into a concert arena with thousands of others, excited for a night of music and memories. It should have been just another evening, one of those nights that you look back on years later and smile. But for Morgan Harrington, there would be no tomorrow, no chance to tell her own story. Because somewhere between the flashing lights and deafening music, between the crowd of strangers and the friends she left behind, she vanished. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a misunderstanding. Something happened that night, something that no one saw, or perhaps, something that some refused to see. She was there, and then she wasn't. Calls went unanswered, messages never read. Hours passed, then days. And then the terrifying realization set in, Morgan wasn't coming home. Months later, on an isolated farm far from where she was last seen, her remains were found, left out in the open like a cruel, final statement. But by who? And why? And how did she get there? At first, the clues were scarce, the questions many. Was it a random act of violence, or was there a reason she was chosen? Was it planned, or was it opportunistic? For months, the case seemed like another tragic story of a missing girl, another headline, another statistic. Until investigators uncovered something else, something that connected Morgan's case to another, something that had been hiding in plain sight all along. And when the truth finally surfaced, it wasn't just about one girl, one night, one crime. It was about a trail of destruction left behind by a man who had walked among us, unnoticed, for years. This is the chilling story of Morgan Harrington, a young woman whose life was stolen too soon. A case that rattled a community, exposed terrifying truths, and left a nation in shock. If you want more in-depth true crime stories, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Now, let's get into the case. It was a cool October night in Charlottesville, Virginia. The streets were alive with energy, thousands of fans making their way to the University of Virginia's John Paul Jones Arena, eager for a night they wouldn't forget. Among them was 20-year-old Morgan Harrington, a bright, ambitious Virginia Tech student with a love for music, especially bands like Metallica. She was with friends, excited, carefree, just another young woman out for a good time. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Nothing felt wrong. But that was the last night anyone who loved her would see her alive. At some point during the concert, Morgan left her friends, saying she needed to use the restroom. But instead of returning, she somehow ended up outside the arena. A strict no re-entry policy was in place. Once you were out, there was no getting back in. What happened in those moments is unclear. Did she mean to leave? Did she get turned around and locked out by mistake? Either way, she was now alone in the night, separated from her friends, her phone in her hand as she sent them a message. She would find her own way home. It was a decision that would change everything. As her friends stayed inside, unaware of the danger she was walking into, Morgan was seen moving through the area, lingering near a parking lot, then by a bridge near the arena. She was spotted by witnesses, some recalling she seemed disoriented, others saying she was trying to get a ride. At some point, she was seen hitchhiking, a young woman, stranded, asking strangers for help. It was a risk, but maybe she didn't see it that way. Maybe she thought she was making the best choice in the moment. Maybe she thought the worst thing that could happen was being stuck outside for a while longer. Then, she was gone. Her friends waited, expecting a text, a call, something to let them know she'd made it home safely. But there was nothing. The night stretched on, then morning came, and still, no sign of Morgan. Her parents, Dan and Gil Harrington, knew something was wrong the moment they learned she hadn't come home. Morgan wasn't reckless. She wasn't someone who would just vanish without a word. Desperation set in. The search began. Flyers went up, social media posts were shared, news stations picked up the story. Everyone was looking for Morgan, but the days passed with no answers, only speculation. Where was she? Who had she been with? What had happened after she was last seen? Then, weeks turned into months. Hope started to fade, but the questions never stopped. Until January 26, 2010. A farmer, making his way across the open fields of Anchorage Farm, a vast, isolated property about 10 miles from where Morgan was last seen, spotted something out of place. A human skull. Then more remains, scattered, exposed to the elements. Morgan had been found. But it was too late. Now, the search for Morgan became something else entirely, a search for justice. Who had taken her? How had she ended up here, miles from the concert she had been so excited to attend? And most chilling of all, was she the only one? Morgan Harrington was more than just a name in a headline. She was a 20-year-old college student with dreams, plans, and a life full of possibilities ahead of her. She was studying education at Virginia Tech, drawn to the idea of shaping young minds, of making a difference. She had a free spirit, an independent streak, a love for adventure, but more than anything, she loved music. It was the kind of passion that made her light up, the kind that pulled her to concerts like the Metallica show in Charlottesville on that fateful night. Her parents, Dan and Gil Harrington, had raised her to be strong, to be confident, to chase what she loved. They never imagined that letting her go to a concert with friends would be the last time they would ever see her alive. When Morgan disappeared, Dan and Gil's world shattered. They weren't just grieving parents, they became relentless advocates, refusing to let their daughter's story be forgotten. They fought for answers, pushed for justice, and in the years that followed, their voices became part of a larger fight for campus safety. Because Morgan wasn't the first, and tragically, she wouldn't be the last. For months, her killer remained a mystery. Investigators followed every lead, piecing together her last known movements, hoping for a break. They had DNA evidence from the crime scene, but no match in any system. No face, no name, just an unknown predator who had taken Morgan's life and vanished. But monsters like these don't stop. Jesse L. Matthew Jr. was a man who had moved through life unnoticed, blending in, escaping scrutiny. He had been a football player, a hospital worker, a cab driver. On the surface, he was just another person in the crowd. But behind that ordinary image was something far darker. There were stories, whispers of past allegations, of women who had encountered him and barely made it away. But without enough evidence, without a conviction, he was free. Free to keep moving, free to keep hunting. Law enforcement, including the Virginia State Police and the FBI, worked tirelessly to put the pieces together. It was a case that demanded attention, a case that had gripped the nation. And then, in 2014, a second name entered the picture, another young woman, another disappearance, another desperate search. Hannah Graham. And this time, when investigators followed the trail, they found what they had been missing all along. A connection. A pattern. A name. Jesse L. Matthew Jr. And when the truth unraveled, it was worse than anyone had imagined. Morgan Harrington had not been his only victim. She was part of a string of crimes, part of a story that stretched further back than anyone had realized. But it wasn't until one girl fought back, until one case cracked open the past, that justice finally came knocking on his door. The night started with excitement, the energy of a sold-out Metallica concert pulsing through the University of Virginia's John Paul Jones Arena. Thousands of fans packed into the venue, music drowning out the outside world. Morgan was among them, swept up in the moment, surrounded by friends. But in the middle of all that noise, in the middle of a crowd of thousands, something happened that would change everything. At some point during the concert, Morgan left to use the restroom. It was a simple decision, something she had done 100 times before. But when she walked out of the main doors, she unknowingly stepped into a situation she couldn't undo. The arena had a strict no re-entry policy. Once you left, you couldn't come back in. She tried to explain, but security wouldn't budge. Her friends were still inside, unaware that she was stuck outside, alone. She called them, letting them know she would find her own way home. But how? It was night. She didn't have a ride, and her car was back in Blacksburg, more than 2 hours away. What happened in the next hour remains one of the biggest gaps in the timeline. What is known is that at some point, Morgan was seen near the Copley Road Bridge, just a short distance from the arena. Witnesses later reported seeing her trying to hitch a ride, her blonde hair and black mini skirt making her stand out against the cold October night. Then, she was gone. The next day, when Morgan didn't return home, her family knew something was wrong. She wasn't the type to disappear without a word. Her phone went straight to voicemail. Texts went unanswered. Calls to friends brought no answers, no one had seen her since the concert. Police were called, searches were launched, missing posters went up. The University of Virginia's campus was combed, security footage reviewed, tips chased down. But nothing. Then, a discovery. Morgan's purse. It was found in a parking lot near the arena, abandoned. Inside, her ID. Her credit cards. But one thing was missing, her phone's battery. Someone had taken it out, making it impossible to track her location. It was an unsettling clue, a detail that suggested someone didn't want her to be found. Weeks passed. The search grew desperate. Volunteers combed fields and wooded areas, hoping for anything that could point to where she had gone. Her parents pleaded for information, their voices breaking under the weight of fear and exhaustion. The case made headlines. True crime forums dissected every detail. But the truth remained buried. Then, on January 26, 2010, 101 days after Morgan vanished, a farmer was walking his property, a vast 742-acre stretch of land known as Anchorage Farm, about 10 miles from where she was last seen. He had walked these fields hundreds of times, but that day, something caught his eye. The remains of a body. The clothing, the jewelry, it all pointed to one devastating conclusion. Morgan had been found. She had been left there, discarded like she was nothing. The medical examiner confirmed the worst, her death was a homicide. But the body had been exposed to the elements for too long to determine the exact cause. The investigation now had a location, but no answers. Who had taken her? How did she get there? What had happened in those final moments? The case took a chilling turn when DNA collected from the crime scene linked to another attack, a violent 2005 assault in Fairfax, Virginia. The perpetrator was still unknown, but now, investigators knew one thing for certain. Whoever had done this had done it before. And he wasn't going to stop. Law enforcement had little to go on in the early days. The discovery of Morgan's body had provided a tragic confirmation, but it raised more questions than it answered. Investigators combed through surveillance footage from the arena, hoping to catch a glimpse of her final moments before she vanished. Witness statements were gathered and analyzed, but no clear suspect emerged. The area where her remains were found offered few clues, no security cameras, no eyewitnesses, just an isolated stretch of land where someone had dumped her and left her to be forgotten. Authorities worked tirelessly, knowing that without a strong lead, Morgan's case risked going cold. They traced her last known movements, scoured her phone records, and urged the public to come forward with information. But months passed, and the case remained frustratingly stagnant. Then, a breakthrough. Forensic testing on evidence recovered from Morgan's remains turned up a match. A DNA profile from her case was entered into CODIS, the National Criminal Database, and it came back linked to an unsolved 2005 sexual assault in Fairfax, Virginia. It was a crucial connection, one that indicated her killer had struck before. The 2005 case involved a young woman who had been violently attacked while walking home late at night. She had survived, but her assailant had vanished, leaving behind only his DNA as a silent witness to the crime. That DNA now tied him to Morgan's murder. This was no random act of violence. It was the work of a predator who had been operating in the shadows for years. Despite this connection, the suspect's identity remained a mystery. Whoever he was, he had never been arrested for a felony before, his DNA wasn't in the system beyond these two crimes. Investigators knew they were dealing with someone dangerous, but they had no name, no face, just a forensic thread linking two brutal attacks nearly 5 years apart. Then, in 2014, another disappearance shocked the University of Virginia community. An 18-year-old student, Hannah Graham, vanished after a night out with friends in Charlottesville. The circumstances were eerily familiar, a young woman alone, in a vulnerable moment, suddenly gone without a trace. Surveillance footage from downtown Charlottesville showed her interacting with a man shortly before she disappeared. That man was Jesse L. Matthew Jr. As authorities zeroed in on Matthew in connection with Hannah's case, they obtained a warrant for his DNA. When the results came back, it was the moment investigators had been waiting for. His DNA was a match. He was tied not only to Hannah Graham's case but also to the 2005 Fairfax assault and, most importantly, to the murder of Morgan Harrington. The evidence was undeniable. For years, a serial predator had walked freely, his crimes hidden in plain sight. Now, with his arrest, law enforcement had finally unmasked the man responsible for a trail of devastation stretching back nearly a decade. Jesse Matthew Jr. stood in court, expressionless, as the charges were read. The weight of years of pain, loss, and unanswered questions filled the room. Families of both Morgan Harrington and Hannah Graham sat in the gallery, their eyes fixed on the man responsible for their daughters' deaths. They had waited for this moment, not for revenge, but for accountability. They had fought for answers, endured the agony of not knowing, and now, at last, the truth had a name. The prosecution laid out the evidence with precision. DNA had linked Matthew to multiple attacks. The 2005 sexual assault survivor had given a detailed description of her attacker. Witness accounts placed him with Hannah Graham the night she vanished. And Morgan, her final movements, the discovery of her remains, the forensic evidence, it all pointed to him. There was no escaping the reality of what he had done. Rather than face a trial where the evidence against him was overwhelming, Matthew chose to plead guilty. There would be no drawn-out courtroom battle, no lengthy witness testimonies, no chance of avoiding the consequences. By admitting to the abduction and murder of both young women, he sealed his fate. The judge handed down the sentence, for consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. He would never walk free again. For Morgan's family, it was justice, though it could never bring their daughter back. For Hannah's loved ones, it was the end of a nightmare they had lived through for far too long. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited for statements. Gil and Dan Harrington spoke not just about their daughter, but about the importance of protecting others. They had turned their grief into action, advocating for safety reforms on college campuses and supporting other families facing similar tragedies. They refused to let Morgan's story fade into the background. For the people of Charlottesville, for students at the University of Virginia, and for every parent who had ever worried about their child's safety, this case left an undeniable mark. It was a reminder of the dangers that could hide in plain sight, the predators who could blend into everyday life, and the devastating impact of a single moment of evil. As Jesse Matthew Jr. was led away, there were no final words from him, no explanation, no remorse. The courtroom emptied, but the scars he left behind remained. Morgan Harrington's story didn't end with the trial. Her name became a symbol of resilience, a painful reminder of what was lost but also a force for change. Her parents refused to let her be defined solely by the tragedy of her death. They carried her memory forward, pushing for better safety policies, warning young people to trust their instincts, to look out for one another, to recognize danger before it was too late. Their efforts led to real changes: improved security measures at large events, stronger public awareness campaigns about personal safety, and a renewed focus on the use of DNA databases to track violent offenders before they could strike again. Morgan's case showed how one crime, when investigated thoroughly, could solve others. If forensic science had not linked Jesse Matthew to the attack in 2005, Who knows how many more victims there might have been. But justice, no matter how complete, doesn't erase the pain. Her family still wakes up every day in a world where she no longer exists. The milestones she will never reach, the life she should have lived, all of it stolen. And for what? A random act of cruelty. An encounter with a man who should never have been free to harm anyone. Morgan Harrington could have been anyone's daughter, sister, or friend. She was just a young woman trying to enjoy a night of music with her friends. A wrong turn, a moment of vulnerability, and she was gone. Her story is heartbreaking, but it is also a lesson, a warning of how quickly things can go wrong, how easily trust can be misplaced, and how justice, when it finally comes, can feel both like a victory and a hollow consolation. Her parents continue their work, speaking to students, fighting for laws that protect the vulnerable, and keeping their daughter's memory alive in the only way they know how, by making sure no one forgets what happened to her. Because forgetting would mean it could happen again. And that is something they cannot allow. Every case like this serves as a haunting reminder of the dangers that exist, the lives that are stolen, and the questions that may never have answers. Morgan Harrington's story isn't just about loss, it's about the power of persistence, the impact of forensic science, and the families who refuse to let their loved ones be forgotten. Her parents continue their work, not just in her memory, but for every young person who walks alone at night, for every missing person whose name may never make the headlines, for every family still waiting for justice. They've turned their pain into purpose, fighting to make sure others don't suffer the same fate. But the reality is, there are still predators out there. There are still crimes waiting to be solved. And there are still families clinging to hope, waiting for the day when they get the answers they desperately need. That's why we tell these stories. Not just to remember, but to remind. To keep the conversations going. To shed light on the cases that need it most. If Morgan's story has moved you, if it's made you think about safety, about justice, about the countless others still waiting to be found, then don't let it end here. Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Join the discussion in the comments, your voice matters. And stay with us as we continue to explore the cases that demand to be told, the ones that refuse to be forgotten. Because somewhere out there, another story is unfolding. And it might be closer than you think.